Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia Online. My name is Jason Freeman, and I'm very excited to be here to introduce tonight's guest, Lawrence Jackson. Lawrence Jackson's award-winning books include The Indignant Generation, a narrative history of African American writers and critics, biographies of Chester Himes, favorite of mine, and Ralph Ellison, and a memoir about his family history titled My Father's Name, A Black Virginia Family After the Civil War. A Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of English and History at Johns Hopkins University, he is also the founder of the Billie Holiday Center for Liberation Arts and a recipient of a 2019 Guggenheim Fellowship. Professor Jackson joins us tonight with his latest book, Shelter, A Black Tale of Homeland, Baltimore, an essay collection that begins with his initial struggle to make Baltimore his home and how his later adoption of the charmed city became a means to re-examine his personal history. It addresses such varied topics as homeownership, fatherhood, race, faith, history, Frederick Douglass, and even the Maryland Shore. One review praises it thusly. Shelter is an intriguing meditation on past and present Baltimore as reflected through the eyes of a Black native son. Lawrence Jackson, deeply ambivalent about returning after years away from his once slaveholding hometown, is a keen observer of the complex interplay between race, time, and place. Surprisingly funny and often unsettling, Shelter is a fascinating read. Tonight's author will be joined in conversation with Solomon Jones, a frequent guest and favorite interviewer for us here in author events. He's an award-winning Philadelphia Daily News columnist, a morning host for 900 AM WURD radio in Philadelphia, and he's the author of the Essence best-selling novel, The Bridge, as well as the critically acclaimed books, Pipe Dream, Ride or Die, Payback, and recently 10 Lives, 10 Demands, Life and Death Stories, and a Black activist's blueprint for racial justice. He is also a blogger and frequent on-air commentator for NPR affiliate WHYY here in Philly, and he's the founder of Words on the Street Literacy, the Words on the Street Literacy Program, and the Rally for Justice Coalition. So let's get right to it. Lawrence, Solomon, thank you both so much for being here, and the screen's all yours.
Thank you, and it is my pleasure to be here with Lawrence Jackson and your book, Shelter, Black Tale of Homeland, Baltimore. Where does the name for this book, Shelter, come from?
Great question. I suppose in some ways, right, it's definitely food, clothing, and shelter. What are the essential things necessary for life or for thriving, really? And I'm also old school house head, so the Shelter Club, means something to those of us on the Eastern Seaboard who appreciate the music of Timmy Regisford and Tony Humphreys, and my college guru, the person who initiated me, was a brother named Ian Friday, who has a global soul music show, sometimes plays at Shelter. So there's a great, sort of irony or play on it too. House music and the house.
Okay, all right. Well, we love house music up here in Philly. I grew up listening to EU Freeze, right? Out of
Okay.
Washington, absolutely.
All right.
So,
Yeah, we just lost
so
some
we
brothers, Stan
appreciate that.
Burns too. So
There you go. There you go. Okay, so Baltimore is an interesting city, and it's one that we visited often, but I don't know that I've really gotten to know Baltimore. I've seen caricatures of Baltimore in the movie Hairspray, but I haven't really seen Black Baltimore. So describe it for me. What is Black Baltimore?
Well, we're a series of closely knit neighborhoods. I do want to say hello to my cousins, Barbara and Mitchell Swan, if you're watching this evening. Like many parts of Philadelphia or the ones that I've had occasion to visit from time to time, a series of really loving and closely knit neighborhoods. Of course, we're also absolutely devastated by neoliberal economic policies. We're devastated by what some people define capital regression. This deep disinvestment in African American communities following basically the assassination of Martin Luther King. I mean, much of this has been charted and measured. And then, of course, Baltimore is also unique for having such a steady epidemic of heroin addiction since the late 1960s. People typically connect that to the return of the Vietnam veterans. But this has been, we have open air drug markets like you do in Philadelphia that have been, open and widespread for more than 50 years. And, it's a suggestion about the nature of the economy or the lack thereof, but also, another evidence of, just a healthcare problem, a problem with employment, a problem with housing, and one that's hurt the neighborhoods. Having said that, because I know that your audience is familiar with The Wire. Having said that, I would just reinforce the thing that I'm saying about the neighborhoods and much of the loving belonging that is a part of what that means. I continue to this day to be incredibly close with about a dozen, maybe more than a dozen people who grew up next door to me in our row houses in the part of the city I'm from, East Arlington. And in fact, that's part of what I try to get at with the series of essays that comprise this memoir, Shelter. Much of what's going on is not really talked about or known or recognized, Brother Solomon.
Mm.
We tend to think of people as either having the experience of growing up in public housing or some kind of suburban ideal that matches effortlessly to what you see, sort of during the comedy shows at 8 p.m. on national television. My experience as a Black American is that our lives are really somewhere in between. Right now, I am the director of something called the Billie Holiday Center for Liberation Arts. And my favorite thing that happens during our annual schedule just took place. The sister Anna DeVere Smith came to Baltimore and she gave a presentation. She's a Baltimore native. I learned today, I think Max Julian is a Baltimore native. I didn't know that, right? I mean, that was like a new one for me. But she came back, and the lecture that she presented is in homage to a dear friend of mine, Donald Bentley, who lost his life in 1989. And it's just this sort of thing where we definitely very much need to recognize some of the great problems and the crises that we have undergoing. I mean, Baltimore is an incredibly violent city right at this time,
Yeah.
but also one where the reason why we're able to survive the violence is because of the close-knit communities. And I was saying that I'm still in touch with all of the folks that I grew up with who grew up in East Arlington, which is a neighborhood it's not Ashburton, that's our middle class community in Baltimore City. And it's not exactly Park Heights, which is the neighborhood that the current mayor grew up in, and is a neighborhood that I also lived in, but which has a little bit more salt and mustard on the sandwich than East Arlington is. Maybe how we would put it. We would go across the tracks to play basketball at Tawanda in Park Heights, and the experience was different than if we went to Webster Kendricks to play basketball in our own neighborhood, that kind of thing.
I hear you.
But that's what's keeping us together. And the thing that's fascinating is that this is a community or a terrain, a geography that played such an essential role in the abolition movement, in the civil rights movement, in the national story of Black life. And it's frequently elided and forgotten, which is a terrible shame. I grew up on the west side of the city, which is where you still have the largest concentration of Black Americans living today. And if you were driving down the interstate, as soon as you leave the waterfront area of Baltimore City, and once you've gotten beyond the stadiums, but I mean like immediately beyond the stadiums, a casual glance north from the interstate shows that this is a section of the city that has seen no major development
Yeah.
in multiple generations.
Mm.
And we have to figure out ways to remedy that. That's part of what we are also dealing with. Again, I use the term capital regression. We have a lot of waterfront development, but not so much development in our own neighborhoods and communities. One of the things that I try to participate in, or to sort of leverage some of the influence that I have in the city, is to help with the rebuilding efforts on Pennsylvania Avenue, where we have a historic Black district recently declared, especially because of the activism of Black young people connected to a group called Leaders for a Beautiful Struggle. But this is the kind of thing we want to make sure that we cherish and revive this incredible history, jazz music and performance that was on Pennsylvania Avenue. And point to that as one of our gems. I bought my first books as a person who was going to go on and spend most of their life in the archive. I bought my first books on North Avenue at Everyone's Place. Nati Nataki, a radio show host, a community organizer and activist, and someone who runs a bookstore with his family, really showing the way to put your roots down in the Black community and to help others to flourish and to thrive. And so, we have, I think we still have many good things going on, and that are an example of the long legacy of, Black history, Black activism, Black arts in Baltimore City.
Hmm. I think that as you talk about this current history, of course, it's attached to a past history. And again, I can't help seeing the parallels between Philadelphia and Baltimore. You have a section in your book that I'd love for you to read from. Starts on page 42, but it reminds me of the story of Octavius V. Cato, who was a man who worked to get Black people to vote. At that time, the party's roles were reversed from what they are now, and was caught up in the violence of an election and was killed. But this kind of reminds me of that. So if you could read from this, man, we'd love to hear it.
Oh, thank you very much. Just so that the viewers might understand, I'm in this chapter. I'm talking about the person that founded the neighborhood I live in today, a man named David Malden Perrine, who was, a highly influential Marylander, was friends with the Supreme Court Justice Roger B. Taney, who, of course, infamously authored the Supreme Court decision against Dred Scott, saying that Black people had no rights that whites were bound to observe. And even though this person, had these such power and influence, I mean, he was very much connected to this legacy of bigotry, though in ways that were cosmopolitan. And I think that this is important for us to grapple with and to wrestle with. And I'm talking in the chapter about some of the changes that took place after the Civil War. And I would also connect myself and my own journey into the neighborhood, more than 100 years afterwards, as a part of this legacy of change. By the time Perrine could get a train between Homeland and his Liberty Street townhouse, the world was changing in other startling ways. Like the Roman dramatist Terence, Black Americans were taking freedom into places that impinged upon the social class ideals of lost cause white Southerners. In July of 1877, African-American Richard Greener, the first Black man to graduate from Harvard, class of 1870, gave a rare book lecture in Baltimore at the brand new Johns Hopkins University, then downtown on Howard Street. The occasion was the 9th annual meeting of the American Philological Association, which Greener had been attending since 1875. A professor of moral and mental philosophy at the University of South Carolina, Greener served as the university librarian and faculty secretary, and he regularly taught Latin classes. He was a highly accomplished bookish man, but his intellectual achievement was not indicative of his distance from the bare-knuckle fight for Black survival. The year before his philology lecture, the light-skinned Black Republican had faced the zealously murderous red shirt mobs of South Carolina Democrats at Wilhala and Pickens. Greener fearlessly stumped for Governor Chamberlain in the fight against the Confederate General Wade Hampton. Hampton's violent victory and the successful disenfranchisement of the Black majority electorate set the course of American history for more than a century. Greener would shortly be forced out of his position at the university and resettle in DC as law school dean at Howard. But the mark of excellence that he set, the Latin professor who often graded white students unsatisfactory, was a volcanic natural rights riposte to the white supremacist. After the war, Albert Bledsoe and his ilk held fast to the idea of the intellectual and moral debasement, which for many thousands of years had been accumulating and growing upon the African race. Greener reacted hotly to such calumny, telling his listeners, if eloquence and pen fail, the Negro must use pistol and bludgeon. The new university in Baltimore that hosted the mixed race band of philologists was based on the radical German model of this seminar and its reading material and busting up tradition. Hopkins president Daniel C. Gilman believed that Black people could be uplifted, and he supported the enrollment of a Black polymath named Kelly Miller at Hopkins in 1887. In the 1890s, as a trustee of the Slater Fund, he groomed Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. Sometimes Gilman favored the Harvard model of education over the German, and in 1894, he directed Du Bois back to the United States from his degree at the University of Berlin so that he could, quote, devote his talent and his learning to the good of the colored race. He even cut off Du Bois' stipend to hasten his return. The week of the Philological Association conference, Gilman was out of town, so the school board president, John Morris, called the meeting to order, thankful that the sectional, sectarian, or political purpose was dormant. Baltimore's mayor, F.C. Latrobe, descended from the U.S. Capitol's architect, checked in on the proceedings. Professor Haldeman from the University of Pennsylvania presided officially over the conference, but much of the public and organizational work was handled by the association's vice president, Hopkins Classics Department chairman, an ex-Confederate junior officer named Basil Gildersleeves. Gildersleeve doubted that Blacks could be uplifted, and he wrote during the war that Northerners were offering Blacks the privileges of social position, which they scorned anyway, and nothing of material guarantees or the present of future profits that might be derived from the war. Gildersleeve did believe in drawing room exclusivity, and he may have had something to do with Greener's presentation being omitted from the official secretary's journal of the conference. But the Baltimore Sun recognized suave Professor Greener, ninth among the experts in the science of language. He was and more. He went against Frederick Douglass and proposed Black migration from the South. Greener aimed sarcastic barbs at Southerners when he told an audience in 1879, "It is true that the Northern people do not love us so well as you did, and hence the intermixture of races is not so promiscuous there as here. This we shall try to endure if we go north, with patience and Christian resignation." Baltimore had contained the largest number of freed people in the 19th century, and heeding Greener's advice to renounce the dream of owning the land where they farmed, its Black population was on the verge of surging again. Black Americans moving north for better lives must have seemed a bit rich to David Malden Perrine, in the same way that Richard Greener's analogies comparing Black Americans to battle-scarred Greeks or Frederick Douglass to Victor Hugo were a bit rich. The richest thing Perrine ever did was to give 9 of his homeland acres and a 17-room parsonage to found Redeemer Episcopal Church. The Episcopal, which means governed by a bishop, church that I grew up in was one my grandmother started to attend in the 1930s. She had married my grandfather in Douglas Memorial Methodist, and that was the church her mother preferred. My church was originally called St. James African Protestant Episcopal Church. The name changed in the 1930s as the final generation of Black members born in slavery were laid to rest. The church's origins go back to a talented old colored man named Jacob C. Greener, who was a lay reader and communicant at Old St. Paul's. Old Greener lobbied the bishop for a Black Episcopal house of worship, sometimes holding services in his own house. One was established in 1824 with the help of a load of bricks and a land gift from St. Paul's, where Perrine had been moving up his pew. To the envy of Perrine, Baltimore had a handful of Black classicists who knew Richard T. Greener's grandfather, Jacob. Among them were the Black priest at St. James, William Levington, abolitionist William Watkins, who ran a school, and William Douglass, who left Baltimore in the 1830s to pastor an Episcopal church in Philadelphia. Although a freedman, Jacob's son, Richard Wesley Greener, left the South in Baltimore for the liberty of Philadelphia, too, where Richard Theodore was born in 1844. That patrimony was a locale, a situation. So in the and again, pardon the gaps, folks, but in the reading, right, Greener was born in Philadelphia, becomes the first Black to go to Harvard. He was this incredible classicist. He went to South Carolina. South Carolina was like the progressive state in the 1870s, right? Great numbers of migrants from all over the South go to South Carolina, where, Black people are in Congress, Black people are in the state legislature, the Black troops are on parade. And Greener was a part of that. And then when the reaction came in, and everybody now has seen exactly what a strong reaction looks like, right? Yeah. When the reaction came in, he was forced out. and he went north, and he encouraged other Black people to do the same, even though it meant taking on the person who was the most eminent figure of the 19th century, and perhaps the most eminent African American of all time, Frederick Douglass. And so I also write about, sort of an encountering Douglass on the eastern shore of Maryland, or trying to think through the politics of Douglass, and really the politics of legendary martial, maybe even chauvinistic kinds of figures, and the necessary grappling that must go on, I would say, Solomon, to be able to come up with something that's innovative and meets the needs of the present.
I find it interesting. The quote that you chose from him, the sarcastic quote about how people in the South love blacks more than those in the North because of the mixing of the races, and of course, much of that, most of that, I would imagine would have been against the will of the black women who had been raped by white slave masters and others. Um, Talk about the irony of that we have this intermingling in so many ways, but it's done in the darkness and not in the light.
Mm. Yeah, this is, of course, that's the tragic irony, also of Black striving, and this is what I really try to get at, sort of the nature of Black middle class life, the particular kind of inheritance that one has, trades upon, uses, leverages, and then at the same time, the cost that goes with that, or that accompanies that. The fact that people were able to survive and gain privilege on the basis of the alms or the gifts or the cast off items from powerful white families, and again, comparative power in the situation of the rural South, and then also Baltimore throughout much of the 19th century, where work was very difficult to obtain for many freed people, and then after the Civil War continued to be very difficult to attain. That these sometimes relationships with whites were pivotal in terms of people's opportunity to advance. So on my mother's side of my family, um, my mother's father was a butler to a German Jewish family who do they have the Hecht Company in Philadelphia?
The what company?
Hecht.
Yes.
Okay.
Uh
Yeah.
huh.
So yeah, my mother's father was the butler to Moses Hecht,
Okay.
and the store starts there in Baltimore, like in the 1890s, and they were eventually able to become a regional clothing merchandising powerhouse. um, we have like something upstairs in one of the children's rooms that was like an animal that they doll that they gave to my mom. I mean, again, after their sort of children had it, and it's sort of curious, so I've kept it. But these relationships enabled some Black people to be able to do things like buy a house on an integrated street, which was the very, very rare experience of my mother's parents, right? Who in 1940 actually purchased a house in Baltimore where segregationist redlining began, right? Where the policies that would restrict people by race to certain blocks, where it was pioneered. The urban South, of course, is sort of key and a leader of the nation in most of these kinds of policies that then become a part of the federal government, Federal Housing Authority during the era of the New Deal in the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
But what was fascinating was that my grandparents lived, on this integrated street near a street corner that became increasingly low down, maybe is the way that I would say it. And in part because of the migration of rural whites to the city. And by the time of the Great Society programs of the early 1960s, I mean, the ones that had been begun under the Kennedy administration and then are carried over in 1963. And when Johnson takes control, my grandparents then sold the house and moved to another part of the city. And the long story short, and just this sort of one interesting example of what happens to Black property and Black wealth was
Mm.
that their house was torn down for a rent ceiling apartment complex, which was up for about two generations, which was then torn down, and new developments for upper middle class, or in Baltimore, what is the upper middle class? Probably in Philadelphia would be, sort of a central middle class. But new houses then go up by the end of the millennium, because the neighborhood still had a sort of a desirable anchor of mainly whites in a middle class neighborhood, adjacent neighborhood.
Mm.
And what happened in terms of my own family history is that after the movement along the segregationist red lines, um, that the property was, consistently devalued. The neighborhood was consistently downgraded to the
Right.
point where we actually wind up selling my grandmother's house around 2005, I think 2005, 2010. And you're selling the house 40 years later for the same price that it was purchased in 1965. And
Yeah.
so that's the economic burden that we carry, or is in some ways the legacy of the race. And so much of the book is, where I'm trying to figure out, okay, is this the solid move that I can make for my own children, so that I'll be able to pass something on to them, so that they will have a legacy and will say, well, dad was a frugal, sober-minded person who made, these decisions, for our benefit. Um, and what sacrifices does that entail? And I really don't mean financial sacrifice is huge, but it's not really so much about the financial part of it. It's really more about the cultural part of it. And
Mm.
what kinds of choices do you make about the neighborhood, the neighbors, and what you wind up having to commit to for success?
Mm. So we have a question that just popped up. You talked about the people that you grew up around, and the people that you knew and still stay in contact with. A woman named Andrea Anderson says this.
Hey,
She says, "Next door neighbor is here."
there we go.
And he is right. We grew up in a place that I want to believe is typical of black neighborhoods that no one talks about. Can't express my gratitude for this recognition of our experience and our reality. To what you would say to that?
Well, Well, that's this is a love fest at this point, right? So this is somebody who is like a sister to me.
Mm-hmm.
We're exchanging gifts every Christmas morning. I'm going over to eat out of mom's pots. Her mother was the person who was the best soul food cook on the block. This is like I said, this is a sister to me. And the experience that we had, I mean, this is in the 1970s. Um, I, I, I mean, I maybe inexpertly before. I would like to affirm that notion that this is the valuable social life that binds Black people together, and one that doesn't get the proper amount of credit. But this is also the way that we survived the situation that we're in, and that is through these incredible social relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. Now, there's another question, and it's about what you said when you opened up and you talked about the effect of neoliberal policies on black communities. And the question is from Eli Thomas. He says, please expound upon what is meant by neoliberal policies which led to problems. This is the first time that I've heard that term. Thank
Wow.
you.
Wow. Yeah, very important question. Um, so what I'm talking about is the shift in government policy, and I mentioned the Great Society programs of Lyndon Baines Johnson. Remember that this is the place. 1965 is the great moment of sort of utopian hopefulness and optimism, especially by many of the prestige members of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King. And then it's also the place where the civil rights movement, public accommodations, and the Voting Rights Act meet the reality of the urban political machine. And King always described this turnaround, that this pivot point for 1965, when the shift to military expenditure and the not even a gradual, but the very rapid withdrawal of federal support from anti-poverty programs, healthcare programs, educational programs, especially employment. It's important to remember at the end of his life, he was an advocate, a strong advocate for full employment and also a minimum living wage. And it is by his assassination and death that we absolutely, sort of as a federal government policy, completely eviscerate the idea that the government would have anything to do with the particular well-being of the citizen, but especially connected to education, housing, healthcare, and employment. I mean, in some ways, though, in my understanding and in my own teaching, race is always front and center. I mean, we don't even have to mention race. And what happens under the regime of Richard Nixon, and some of the economists that he was fond of, they begin to unleash really a new model, and they do it globally, but especially in South America with the overthrowing of different socialist governments, but especially in the government of Chile. And the neoliberal policy is that the state's sole responsibility, that the police and the military, and even in some ways like the emergency medical technician, that the sole responsibility is to protect the conditions for free, unregulated market exchange. That the only thing that the state wants to do is to make sure that the entrepreneurial market can flourish. And so, really, coming right from that moment, we begin to have all of these things that sometimes we can't identify, like school voucher programs or different choices for retirement programs. When I started working, I finished my doctorate degree in 1997. You had you're right at the tail end of having the option to sign up for a pension plan, right? People are not convinced that Social Security is going to be a possible form of retirement, but that the idea that in 1997, even that you would put all of your retirement savings in the stock market was one that was, it was an unsteady, untried kind of idea. We are now living, 25 years later, almost 30 years later, we're living in a completely different world where the fate and the fortunes really for the entire middle class of the country are now increasingly connected to the quote unquote health of the stock market, right? Which is, in my view, right, which would be this like putting your money in a casino, basically, right? Um, so it's a fundamental shift, but these would be like some of the policies of neoliberalism, that the state wouldn't invest in education or healthcare. It would leave those things to the market. If you want good schools, you'll move to where good schools are. You'll pay for good schools. You'll sacrifice your social relationships, your community. You'll sacrifice your free time or your recreation to do things to participate in the market as an entrepreneur. And I would just say, what was the person's name, Brother Solomon? Was it Thomas?
I'm sorry. Timon Blanton was the person, and I apologize if I am. I'm sorry. Eli Thomas was the person who answered that question, asked that question.
Eli Thomas. I was just conclude by saying that when I lived in West Africa, in Cote d'Ivoire, in 2013 and 2014, that was really a moment of revelation for me, where I really began to understand what it meant to not so much be born in the United States or to have an American passport or an American identity or to think fondly of the nation state, or, to have, I don't know, 10, 15 generations of your forebears buried in the United States. But the what was compelling to people about the United States, like why they wanted to move there. People in West Africa would say to me all the time, "Oh, put me in your suitcase. I want to stow away and try to get to the United States." People, remember the thing about the U.S. troops leaving Afghanistan and how horrifying it was to see
Yeah.
people, hiding in the wheel wells of the aircraft because they feared the Taliban. People in West Africa hide in the wheel wells of the aircraft just to try to get to France, and people are always freezing to death and having these horrible deaths because they are willing to risk everything, right? Get in an open boat in off the coast of Senegal and try to steer up to the Mediterranean. They're willing to risk everything for a particular kind of economic opportunity. But that's what I was learning about the United States and then also the West, was that people were coming here because they saw a chance for a particular kind of entrepreneurship. As a Black American, that was not, I would say, that was not native to my own experience. I mean, I have family members who purchased 40 acres sometime between 1865 and 1880, who wanted to be independent farmers, who spent their best years in slavery, but then figured that the way to really be independent is to buy my own land and to be able to pass that on to my family. But this idea of like, making a fortune or looking for the bonanza, and then trying to develop these huge capital projects, that's not something that I was personally familiar with. But that very much is what is the driver in the United States. I would say maybe the one piece of continuity over many generations, and it's one of the contradictions that comes up in the book Shelter. I'm a member of the Episcopalian Church, and in some subtle ways, I try to get at how this Protestantism, also, the Max Weber, the famous sociologist, also feeds into this, right? The Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism.
Mm.
Not even so much what the riches are, but that there's an inner working of this philosophically that people connect to. And so I'm always, also another kind of major tension for me.
Hmm. We have about 15 minutes left. We have a couple of more questions, but I think we need to hear a little bit more from this book. And the book, of course, is Shelter: A Black Tale of Homeland, Baltimore. We're speaking with Lawrence Jackson. He is the author of this book, and it's a piece that talks about action as opposed to what we say. So it starts on page 218 of Shelter.
Thank you very much, brother. Um, I'm talking in this chapter about what might we do? How do we respond to the conditions? And it's at a public event, and I talk about a couple of public events in West Baltimore. Ritualistic, perhaps, fighting that doesn't involve firearms is hardly newsworthy. Throughout 2019, the city's deadliest per capita year and very nearly its deadliest year, regardless of the population, Fox News hosted a series of city in crisis town hall meetings, several of them in neighborhoods that had rarely seen cameras asking residents their opinion on critical matters of governance. The station arranged a panel filled with prosecuting attorneys and police administrators and political aspirants, and invited the most powerful city elected officials, who confirmed, then withdrew from the event. I took my 14-year-old high school freshman because I thought it was important for him to see the part of the city his father identified with, and in the same way that my own father habitually exposed me to the world when I was my son's age. We crossed the campus of a teacher's college that had recently built a new 10,000-seat gymnasium in the place where the funeral home once stood that prepared my dad's body for burial. We walked around a bit until we find the auditorium, where buff policemen with assault rifles and flak vests scan the crowds. As is our pattern, my son sat in the back and buried his head in his textbook, and I sat closer to the stage to supplement my weakened vision. Wretchedly, my hearing is still quite good. The panelists never had the opportunity to justify their own work buttressing the police state because they were shouted down by audience members who lined up to perform soliloquies. The audience of concerned citizens abounded with organizational leaders, petty entrepreneurs who had overcome drug addiction, prison, failing school systems, and poverty, and are now deeply invested in solving the problems of the city. The audience overwhelmingly backed governmental solutions to eradicate poverty, especially Christian organizations brokering with the state to hire and pension ex-felons. Jesus of Nazareth, the founder of socialism. A lone elected official, born and bred in the city, braves the public meeting and tries to address the audience from the floor. Attempting to propose government solutions to crime, he will be drawn into a ritual rhetorical combat. The seer white moderator puts her microphone to the councilman with the $64,000 question. How can we stop city murder? Having waited his turn in the long line of Christian pensioners, the elected official starts off in a friendly, sincere manner. I've heard him before and know that he is a poet of the language. A thin man in a rhinestone jacket must have heard him before too. He risks his liberty in a prime denunciation of the councilman. But what are you going to do? The rhinestone jacketed man cries, easily booming over the councilman using the public address system. What are you going to do? No longer a question, but an imperative. When uttered again, it is an exclamation turning into a profanation. And again, and again. The jacketed man becomes intoxicated by this new power and keeps testing the volume limits of the human voice. He is a disruptor and male and might become the focus of the appointed guardians of physical restraint. But silencing the councilman is enough. He does not leap over the seat to face his enemy, but manages to content himself with his place in the seventh row of the seats on the opposite side of the auditorium. The heavily armed policemen in bulletproof vests walk down to his aisle, but decide to leave him be. The mechanical microphone is no match for him. Whenever Councilman Pinkett attempts to approach the problem of street violence, as soon as he begins to speak, what are you going to do? Shamefaced, Pinkett withdraws in frustration after attempting to brook the ungovernable. The event was a magisterial example of the burning heat known to accompany light. I had a point or two to make, but know that the line is long and the ferocity of the heckling suggestive of the result. A woman in the front row in a red dress jumps to her feet to loudly mourn her deceased sister. A community activist who holds sidewalk prayer vigils whenever violent death occurs declares Hopkins both the source of the problem and, through its scientific community and public health resources, the only possible solution. The red dress woman returns to her feet, this time shouting out the street address and names of the parents of the man she has accused of her sister's murder. Her outrage is raw and shrill, and she teeters wildly from the edge of emotional collapse to outraged fury. As the meeting fully unravels, a small woman in sweat clothes rushes the stage and attacks the microphone, reeling off a litany of conspiracies before the heavily armed guards drag her off, either committed to securing the proscenium or having identified a mark they can reach. Somehow I took these signs and wonders as an invitation to insert the tradition of the abstract thinker. The Episcopalian committed to his orderly liturgy thought palaver of the professors was the ingredient missing from the restive Black public sphere. I thought the extra scholastic community would benefit by exposure to the professors more than the politician and preacher. At a school like Hopkins, the world comes to its auditorium. My colleagues in creative writing in French and Italian and political science, as well as assorted student groups invited week in and week out, writers and thinkers whose ideas were on the cutting edge and in great demand, people fawned over by the national newspapers and glossy weekly magazines. Sometimes I would race the 4 miles up to Nathaniel's school, fetch him, prepare dinner, and run back to hear the Marxist geographers, the literary surrealists, the jazz innovators, the writers who had won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award in the same year, or twice in 5 years, the poet read by the nation and the Nigerian photography critic. The audience was almost always lily white and heavy with people from the nearby neighborhoods. While universities today are, like my friend Francois Furstenberg says, a tax shelter for the endowment, To retain their tax-exempt standing, even the private ones are compelled to make educational efforts publicly available. But Black Baltimoreans always think that they will be charged a fee or tested in some way to prove their right to tread Hopkins' rarefied grounds. There are uniformed guards at every entrance. And I just have to say, as a sidebar, the president of Johns Hopkins used to be the provost at the University of Pennsylvania. And I recently visited the University of Pennsylvania, and I had a difficult time presenting my identification every time I went into an academic building. In other words, like, it began to grate on my personality after a while. And it is Black people asking you this, and these are some of the bedrock jobs that you can get in that part of Philadelphia. But nonetheless, it was just, there was something that was so uh, uh, um, destructive in that relationship. And I mean, something that many people think of as a matter of course.
Hmm.
Once um, Hopkins rarefied grounds, there are university guards at every entrance. Once, when the bike riding duo of Mitchell and I attempted to leave one of my books on slavery and memory on the steps of the president's house, the guards became quite vigorous. The new digital registration formats are a kind of quiet apartheid mechanism whereby private information must be exchanged in place of cash. Registration requires the latest computer equipment with the latest software and the leisure to fill out forms and to know your schedule in advance. The eradication of spontaneity and subordination to central planning is the primary control feature of the digital world.
Mm,
I stop
mm.
there, because I don't want to just sort of keep reading at the audience, but I hope that you get a sense of some of the, I keep using the word grappling. I was on the wrestling team in high school and college. Some of the wrestling that's going on here. How do we choose the best path? What do we need to keep in play? As Ralph Ellison always said, the mind that conceives of the solution has to keep the problem that necessitated the solution in sight.
Mm.
And so I'm always sort of bringing up this strong ambiguity. And the thing that I did, I created something that's called the Billie Holiday Center for Liberation Arts. We invite all of our Philadelphia friends down to our September the 10th Jazz in Lafayette Square concert. That will be our fourth annual concert of homage to Billie Holiday. We can share Billie Holiday in the same way that we share William Greener. Holiday, born in Philadelphia, but
Mm.
is a bred Baltimorean. Her parents are Baltimoreans. She was raised in Baltimore. So I would be delighted if people would come down and enjoy the jazz concert. So we're trying to bring the audience back to Black West Baltimore for a
Mm.
free public concert. We have the lecture devoted to my friend Donald Bentley, who lost his life in 1989, Anna DeVere Smith, whose ancestor was one of the founders of the Sharp Street Methodist Church, which arguably is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, Black church in the United States. She gave the lecture 2 weeks ago on April the 22nd. And then we have the Helena Hicks Emancipation School, where we give the professors an opportunity to present their ideas at one of our community church partners. Tonight, Professor Sasha Turner is actually speaking at the same time that I'm speaking. She's a world-class historian of the experience of Caribbean slavery and motherhood. So I know that she was fantastic, even though I didn't get a chance to hear her. Next week, Brother Richard Lofton will be talking about the using an interview database to understand what's going on with Black urban schools.
Mm.
So that's the contribution that I've tried to make in collecting Black archives, so that the memory and the history of the city will be preserved.
Mm.
So that's what I've tried to do, and thanks so much for teasing out some of this in the conversation, Brother Solomon.
Absolutely. You are so welcome. We still have a couple of questions from our viewers. We have about 9 minutes, so we'll try to run through them.
Okay, great.
You mentioned Billie Holiday, and Timon Blanton said, would you talk about how your commitment to Billie Holiday's legacy amplifies your own work and concerns?
Oh, wow. A beautiful question, beautifully framed and phrased. So, Holiday needs to be remembered for this. This is the jazz music performer who defies it was the Department of Treasury, or it's coming out of the Department of Treasury, but what became, basically the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And, I think even more damagingly and nefariously, what became the counterintelligence program by the 1950s. But in the 1930s, at the end of the 1930s, she willfully, aggressively defied the government bureaucrats and insisted on performing the song "Strange Fruit." And she paid a terrible price. I mean, she is ultimately imprisoned. She is persecuted and imprisoned because of this systematic ritualistic defiance. It is also connected to her unwillingness to adhere to the codes of segregation, racial segregation, places where she performed, people that she chose to be in love with, the way that she lived her life. She was a walking symbol of absolute utter defiance of racism and the codes of segregation and the obliteration of Black people and Black life. At the same time, she set a bar for artistic excellence that has not been surpassed. It's magnificent. It's remarkable. And I suppose really I just want to talk about the things that would make us would uplift us at this moment. We hold the concert in Lafayette Square at the corner of Lafayette and Arlington. Uh, Also, because we recognize that Billie Holiday lived in this community on Argyle Avenue, on Fremont Street, literally 2 blocks away. It's also the neighborhood where she was. I believe that she was sex trafficked, but it's a neighborhood where she was trafficked and raped, and where she was taken to the police station as an 11-year-old and then sent to the reformatory. I mean, she actually been a resident of the Good Shepherd Home for colored girls, is what it was called, the year before, but she returned. And it's a deep part of her pain and tragedy, and also a strong part of her overcoming and her transcendence. And so I get inspired from that every day. And what we really try to do is we bring in a fantastic vocalist, Sheila Ford, the Philadelphian, born in Baltimore, but making her career out of Philadelphia, Mama Una Yusuf. She has performed for us for 2 consecutive years. And so this year we're going to have Navasha Daya, the Baltimore vocalist. And so we always have somebody who is very, very soulful, very, very connected to an organic person from the Black community, from this community, and then giving them the opportunity to engage in classic music from the United States, which is jazz. And we have the world class, I call them the Lafayette Square Jazz Stars, All Stars, world class jazz musicians, the percussionist Nasser Abadi, the trumpetist Sean Jones. You can't go wrong. And it's like the best 4 hours you've ever spent in your life. We also do things at the concert like make video recordings of the people's experiences with segregation. So we are actively recording public history at that moment. And it gives us an opportunity to celebrate so many of the people in the neighborhood and to talk about the community organizations that are at the center of any kind of transformative practice that we would wish to take place.
So we got about 5 minutes. There are two questions of the questions that remain that I want to ask, and one of them, of course, is the question of the day, and it is this from LK says, "What will be the repercussions of Roe being overturned?"
Ooh. Um, yeah, boy, what can I say?
Hmm.
I have to I have to give a shout out to my dear friend and former Philadelphia resident from about 1998 until 2000, maybe 95 to 2012 or so, Brother Craig Carr, who is the chairman of the African American Studies Department at Howard University. And about 3 weeks ago, he was talking about the elevation of Ketanji Brown Jackson, and he was using the refrain from a Beach Boys song because I guess one of the Beach Boys had passed away on that day or something. But it was majestic the way that he made an argument about what he would like to see from the newly elevated justice, and he kept saying, "Wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be nice?" And that's what I would say, that we are about to find out the significance of the power of the judicial branch. The judicial branch is about to exercise its power in a way that will certainly be comparable to the 2013 decision that we no longer needed voting rights protections, and then also the decision that enabled the unlimited corporate contributions to political campaigns. In my lifetime, no decision has surpassed the 2000 election, where the Supreme Court unilaterally decided to end the voting recount of a state where the Florida State Supreme Court had said, okay, this is the just thing to do, is to count the votes. And then including the vote of a justice whose son was working as a lobbyist at the time for groups that were invested in ending the recount. The Supreme Court unilaterally prevented the recount from taking place. So we're about to witness the real power of the judicial branch. But I think that what I would like to see take place is, wouldn't it be nice, strong, vigorous dissent from the incredibly vocal, or let's just say somebody who has a soapbox at this time and who is globally known and who symbolizes something that, in my view, perhaps even Vice President Kamala Harris doesn't symbolize. Wouldn't it be nice to me if, at the very least, we got vigorous dissent and affirmation of the rights of women, and especially Black women at this time, from the most prominent Black woman, again, in my view, maybe on planet Earth. So maybe we'll see that. I mean, perhaps not, but I would certainly like to hope for that. Relative to what the decision will do. Uh, um, it seems an almost calculated example of reducing or decimating or diminishing the newly established or new gains of a generation of women. And the question also is, will women permit this? I mean, I couldn't have predicted, or was quite surprised at especially among the white American public, the support of Black Lives Matter activists and activism in the summer of 2020. Certainly that could be surpassed at this time, and that the public outcry could be real and quite vigorous. I mean, if the public insists, then the court will not be able to function. And final point, I would just say that you got these different powers: executive branch, judicial branch, and legislative branch. But the fourth branch, the free press, absolutely has to be heard from. And certainly I would like to try to make small contributions in that way. That we have to elevate our discourse to combat injustice.
So, final question, and it's not fair because we're down to like a couple of minutes. Comes from Musa Abdur Rahman. He says, two-part question. As a fellow native Baltimorean, what are your thoughts on the negative portrayal of Baltimore? Specifically, it seems that we've been singled out amongst other urban cities, i.e., the many HBO series. Why?
Did he say The Wire specifically, or?
He did not.
No. Right. Yeah. So to me, it is a convention or a feature of neoliberalism. In other words, you keep looking for places to extract surplus, and perhaps you can't find what the appropriate entrepreneurial niche is to turn over the bonanza. And so, in the case of Baltimore, I mean, in some ways, the niche has become like turpitude or just the homicidal mania. Let's exploit the fact that citizens are under siege in Baltimore City, and it can be most successfully exploited, on broadcast television or the cable stations or that kind of thing. um, it's important to always recall that so many of these stereotypes of Black life, many of them were generated, focusing on the free Philadelphia population, right? That's where the Zip Coon stereotype of the freed person who was profligate with their resources and couldn't buy a house because they're supposed to be just outspending the money gleefully, recklessly, wantonly. um, and that there was also a stereotype of a Black brute, the one that's made taken advantage of by David Wark Griffith in the film Birth of a Nation. And in some ways, even though these stereotypes, that they transform and they take on, sort of new roles, or there's a slight shift in their deployment, there's also, a kind of a consistency with them. The other point I would make is that I was recently reading that the World Trade Organization, at the beginning of the millennium, was very interested in turning to licensing culture, and or perhaps it really had to do with prohibiting particular kinds of restrictions and regulations with African culture. And they were very much resisted by, sort of many West African nations, Central African nations, where people are saying, look, we don't want these patterns or these rituals or ceremonies or this music. We don't want it to just be, sort of the soundtrack for Disney or these other multinational corporations. We want to be able to control and to prevent from the exploitation, different sorts of cultural products. And I think that that's maybe, in some ways, the kind of statement that we need to insist upon from Baltimore, where we have produced so many, just remarkable figures. I mean, I mentioned Anna Devere Smith earlier, but we are often prey to exploitation from outside.
Yeah. That is Lawrence Jackson. He is a professor at Johns Hopkins University, also the author of the new book, Shelter, A Black Tale of Homeland, Baltimore. Man, I want to thank you so much for just sharing with us tonight with the Free Library of Philadelphia. And I wish you the very best with your book and all of your work, brother. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right. Take care.